Welcome, everybody. My name is Stephen Legg, CEO and co-founder of Antigen Security. I'm joined, as always, by the brilliant and amazing Kirsten Bay, CEO of Cysurance. Welcome, Kirsten.
Hello there. Thank you for having me again.
Of course. Today, we're here to talk about uh, all the latest trends, news, and industry happenings in the cyber insurance world. And specifically today, we have a particularly interesting topic, something, Kirsten, you and I have been talking about for quite a long time. But really refreshing to see others validating the research that we've done. Um, there's a recent report this month that came out from Marsh McLennan that links cybersecurity controls to reduce cyber risk. And I guess to get us started, Kirsten, what were your takeaways when you first read this report? I guess how did it strike you? What were kind of the initial impressions that came to mind?
Well, in a quick summation, see, it actually works when you do the things you're supposed to be doing, right? So to your point, it's the validation. Um, in the cyber seatbelt concept, what I think is very important and exciting about it is that it enables us to really speak to different sizes and maturity levels of organizations and to orient organizations to you don't have to have every bell and whistle or every security tool in the world to be able to have defenses to protect yourself, to reducing severity and impact. And I think that it's such an interesting thing between security world and insurance world, but they're actually much more aligned when we think about frequency, severity, and impact, which are the three most important insurance words there are. That this statement and this report really helps us identify how those are being effective and reducing particularly the impact and severity. And so, we have new things coming at us that we are reading about every day. We know that the adversary is going to continue to evolve. But what we also know, because we talk about it a lot just between the two of us, is how defense in depth and these controls help mitigate and reduce the concerns around those aspects.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that was both heartening and a really important takeaway that I would say kind of resonated across the whole research article. Um, Defense in depth, but the fact that we don't have to boil the ocean to defend ourselves, right?
Exactly.
Like we can meaningfully select controls and risk mitigation measures in a way that actually makes it defensible. And while you can't stop every attack, you can catch most of them pretty early. And I think I wasn't surprised to see some of the kind of key conclusions they talked about, um, ongoing hardening and patching of systems. They talk about the importance of endpoint detection and response, multi-factor authentication, privileged access management. And as we've kind of talked about in previous conversations, these technologies are what is kind of fomenting as the core of really cybersecurity for any organization,
Correct.
regardless of what particular tools they select to implement in those lanes. Those things together create a very a layered and effective, not perimeter, but line of defense on the endpoint and throughout the organization. And I guess one of the things that the questions that I had, especially with how much how much your work intersects on the Cysurance side with both product companies as well as service providers, people experiencing the risk, right, and trying to mitigate it. Um, do you do you agree with some of um, the conclusions that they drew in terms of the ratio of attacks? Like, is that consistent with what you've seen? I think that the one of the figures that they threw out kind of early midway through the paper was that it's about around 6 times less likely to experience attack if they do all of these things. What are your thoughts there?
Yes, I would say that in our experience and what we see, that's about accurate.
Mm,
Certainly, it's the counterexample that one can speak to more effectively because that's a little bit of a how long is a piece of string kind of question.
mm,
Because we do know that with a lot of providers, we're seeing like I've one specifically where from mean time to no to mean time to remediation, we're talking 5.7 minutes, right? So that certainly changes the dynamic of the 260 some odd days. Although, 2 years ago it was 360 some odd days, so we are improving even on that side. But the being able to identify and rapidly remediate is the really key component. Where the counter example I think is even more important and stark is when we look at a recent incident that we were a party to, where the organization shut off their multi-factor authentication as well as their API connection to some of the endpoint management software. So that was a severe event. And really what made it particularly severe beyond the obvious pieces is that being able to rapidly identify that there was a compromise was the challenge. And so what we're seeing is that when they're not in place, those are the areas where it's likely that that event still, of course, would have occurred, but that it would have been much more rapidly caught and probably remediated before there was ever an incident, an insurable incident. And that's the thing that I think there's this distinction that is important to be drawn, where we discuss these incidents that are sort of, we'll say, common, right? That they're happening fairly commonly inside organizations. They're often remediated, but then we have insurable events. And what sort of indicator of compromise, incident, to now we have an insurable event, and how do we intersect those 2 points between our organization and your organization so that we're aligned to the things that matter equally to us, when it's important to, of course, remediate incidents that are just low-level incidents.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, I completely agree. And I think this distinction specifically is one that has taken a long time for the insurance industry to wrap its head around, and seeing reports like this is kind of the start of a common discussion around this, I feel like, in the industry. And I completely agree with everything you said. And I would say the thing that we see in helping specifically and especially service providers defend themselves and their customers, we see this all the time. Customers or folks that have those things in place, overwhelmingly, almost all of the incidents they experience are going to be what you described, that like non-claim inducing incident, right? It's a contained early stage attack that was prevented from causing any kind of serious or material damage. And so whether it was prevented outright from a control like MFA or identity and access management, or caught with a tool like EDR and isolated and responded to quickly, to your point, that like mean time to detect and mean time to respond, that becomes a much more narrow window if all of these things are being done correctly. And so I guess the follow-on question I have inside of that is, what do you think? Because what we're seeing now from criminals that have, and I don't know how much you've noticed this, but we've seen a ramping up in criminal activity really since like probably the end of last year, and it hasn't stopped. But criminals now are kind of adjusting their approach to accommodate the changes that carriers have made on the payment and financial side, because many carriers are now not automatically approving these large ransoms or just kind of passing that through. They're pushing back, they're questioning, they're requiring more both of the insured and kind of holding or disincentivizing the attackers to make a large gain from that. So from your perspective, what do you think what do you think that is, or how do you think that's going to play out in terms of the industry-wide conversation that's now happening as a result of both the national cybersecurity strategy that was announced and some of the other specifically like vendor risk management and other frameworks that are now kind of trending in the direction that this report is suggesting, and advocating for just kind of basic cyber hygiene? How do you think that'll play out with the carriers and the claims that are now coming through kind of more modern as post all of this kind of conversation?
Well, I think the first point is to operate from the thing that we know, which is that the adversary will always adjust, always, And we know this. I mean, I think back to when Zeus and credential theft was our biggest concern, lo these many years ago, 10 years ago, or however many years it was. But it felt at that time with the, what, 140 million variants of Zeus that propagated,
Mhm.
that really was the worst thing that could happen to us. And that's long forgotten now at this point. And so I think part of it is recognizing the need generally to understand what you just said, which is that basic cyber hygiene is relevant no matter what the attack profile is or what the
Mhm.
telemetry is, because that's something that will be forever a whack-a-mole game that we will play. And so we have to be very clear that these controls do these things. And we know that. And we know that broadly, it hasn't really changed substantively from the point of view we've gotten better at things like threat hunting or
Mhm.
understanding threat intelligence or other things. But there is sort of just the fundamentals, and then how do we build on the fundamentals? And I think that's the part from the insurance perspective that I think is still very, I wouldn't say nascent, but squishy, maybe technical
Mhm.
term, because people, they really want to know how to manage what would they call the silent cyber question, which is, what is the thing that we haven't thought of that we should ask a question about? And I
Mhm.
think that it has to be a bit more broad, because then it more broadly takes in the things that we haven't anticipated, but we know are effective. And if you haven't done them, then the likelihood of having severity or frequency is much higher. So when we think about like that 6x figure, then that becomes, well, what are all the scenarios in which that helps mitigate these potential risks? And that's really, I feel like there's a lot of specificity towards, we want to stop ransom. And it's like, no, that's a symptom. We want
Mhm.
to stop the things that allow whatever that malware might be to get them in, or how we catch it. And I think that that's more the focus. And so certainly PAM is a big one. I think, that we will continue to evolve around, and how also services play into this, because I'm a firm believer, and I watch this a lot as we've evolved, is that either whether it's monitoring services or so on, that services, as opposed to just kit, play a very fundamental role in supporting organizations and mitigating threats.
Mhm. Well, services and certainly the architecture and I guess the unspoken parameters of how that service is delivered. You know,
Mhm.
the whether we're talking about SLA, whether we're talking about the hygiene and practices that come along with a part of implementing and deploying and transitioning those things to stakeholders internal to companies. Completely agree with that. I think that's a uh, not often discussed, but often very relevant conversation, especially when we see um, claims come or we work on claims that involve third parties that were providing services that connect in some way to either the data or systems of the victim organization, and just kind of watching that play out, it really kind of raises the bar for anyone that's providing any of those kind of services and those types of system integrations, because whether you're talking about an API, AI itself, and how organizations are leveraging that technology, or how attackers are leveraging those things, um, that is very much the relevant conversation. How are we protecting those things? Are is and these are all really basic questions, right? Like, how are we protecting those things? Is the authenticated party really the party that should be accessing this? None of this is, I would say, rocket science from a cybersecurity perspective, but these are practical questions that a lot of organizations just frankly weren't asking themselves or their vendors um, through the course of doing business. They just kind of went and kind of let it fall by the wayside, and security was always kind of an afterthought. And so that's, I think, my what I take away from that, and hearing your feedback, um, is that I think integrating vendor risk conversations with the normal process of business and making it not such a distinct life cycle that requires its own care and feeding, but something that is inherently a part of the way you do business with third parties as an organization, especially when you're a service provider, I think is that's the real key for folks that want to get ahead of that particular piece. Um, the I brought something up that I want to ask your input on relative to this, and just kind of the cyber risk conversation in general. With the emergence of AI, and like I don't know how much you've seen this in the circles that you operate in, but we've seen some pretty immediate and dramatic impact from AI on things like business email compromise.
Mhm.
The squirrel waffles of the world, folks doing kind of mass campaigns, ingesting and using all of that data from those real emails to make very convincing spoofs and phishes that often will evade detection by even the most modern systems. I guess, what are your thoughts on how the insurance world will keep up with emerging trends like that? And I know you kind of answered this in a way, saying that we'll have to continue to evolve, but in particular in regards to AI and kind of this cyber hygiene mentality, what do you think kind of the initial takeaways or initial approach should look like for most folks that are first experiencing or hearing about this?
Yes, well, it's interesting how many people still aren't even aware of what Chat GPT is, let
Hmm.
alone its capabilities and the concerns that we have around potential compromise. So I think part of it is education, and we really do need people to understand how to be more vigilant. It's difficult when you have hundreds of emails coming in all the time,
Hmm.
but it is something that, from the PAM perspective, I think we have to be so careful about privilege escalation. That I think is going to be one of the key focuses for us, generally on it's likely someone's going to click on those links and it's not their fault, right? And I think part of what we have to do, and we talk about this a lot in cyber, is kind of the fault shaming thing that has a tendency to happen. I think
Hmm.
we have to be much more collectively community oriented around these things are going to happen because we can't it's difficult to defend. And so if it's difficult to defend, what's the mitigation, what's the compensating control? And so I do think the focus has to shift a little bit to how are we managing privilege escalation, and so the PAM pieces of it, because we know now that stopping it at using those tools can stop those emails. They may just slip through. So I think that's a big part of it. And so when we focus on that, as opposed to your earlier statement of boiling the ocean, how do we specifically start to really put guardrails around those areas where we know we have to have compensating controls, and to be very specific about them, not from an insurance perspective, because specificity causes other things to go unguarded, but
Hmm.
how do we get specificity around, if we know that this is a particular risk, then how are organizations dealing with potential lateral movement as a reason or result of that intrusion?
Got it. So I guess, let me just restate this back to you and make sure that I'm understanding you correctly. So what you're saying in effect is, rather than building essentially an understanding or kind of specific response to AI in particular, you see it as a better response both for organizations and insurers to, as an example, highlight the need for data control, and
Mhm.
not entering sensitive or company or customer data into a generative AI like ChatGPT, rather than saying, oh, you must have a generative AI defense that meets these requirements and does this thing and has these bells and whistles. Is that accurate?
Yes, I mean, when we have those, I mean, certainly, but we know this, that it will evolve, right? And
Mhm.
so we go back to the fundamentals conversation, and fundamentals can take us a certain distance, especially as we're all figuring out how to mitigate against those risks and for implementation of those tools, because we know that implementation takes time, understanding the effectiveness, all the things that go into you the way that the adversary can rapidly adjust to the new capabilities, whereas we have to figure out, how does that fit into our system, how do we implement it, who gets it, all those questions that happen for organizations large and small.
Mm.
So we know that there's some part of it we can rest on fundamentals, and that those fundamentals allow us then to create building blocks once we have the tools available to us that we know will be effective in creating solutions. And also we know that some of, like, email vendors who are already filtering for those types of incidents can accelerate their capabilities. But in the meantime, or in addition to, right, I think we know that certain functions will still be effective. And the segmentation one, Pam, just the basic ones that we talk about a lot in these discussions, will still bear fruit, I think, in the respect of creating those mitigations, or at least compensating controls.
Yeah, no, I agree, and I think as an outcome, it's more relevant a discussion to say, okay, well, while the defense tooling industry is catching up and figuring out where to integrate things like generative AI or quantum computing or whatever the next kind of major technical innovation might look like, those basic hygienes combined with awareness that those things exist, right? And just having a conversation of, okay, well, how does this impact our risks? Are there any scenarios that involve these technologies or things that we need to solve for? And that's a conversation you can have absent any specific technical solution or silver bullet, as it were, for that particular like AI or generative AI as a general concept or example. Those kind of related threats.
It's true. And I was just reading not long ago that, there are still 0 days being exploited every day. There were 55 in the last week. Right. And so, there's always going to be something, and the always something. And, and of course I think there's a little bit of FUD around some of those things, because we also know that 0 days are more effectively exploited if your systems aren't patched. And, so again, I mean, it always kind of comes back to the same root of this conversation. And so I think we will all continue to evolve, but we also have to somewhat accept that we're going to be a couple steps behind, because our sole mission in life as companies isn't necessarily just to create these boundaries to protect our organizations. We're running companies, and so the mission statement of what we do is different than what they do, and so part of it is, I think, accepting that we will be a little bit behind.
Yeah, well, I think a perfect example is, banks have very sophisticated physical security systems, but they don't themselves as an organization specialize in lock technologies,
Right.
right? They're
Exactly.
they're not going to try to make any advances. They're trusting the experts in those areas that are making product and services to those standards. But then the conversation they're having internally is, well, what else have we thought of? What else could happen given this new emerging trend or change. And it's the same conversation in the cyber world, I think, from a security and cyber insurance perspective, because that's really what like, if I had to boil down the one thing I would have any customer that has complained about it, whether it's a claim or just an incident or whatever, that has gone through that, the thing ultimately, to your point about the root cause being the same, the thing ultimately that all of those organizations have in common is that they weren't having these conversations. They weren't even thinking about this stuff before those things happened. And so that, I think, is an outcome. If that's the thing that changes, and we, as an industry of a community of businesses, I should say, all collectively understand that, hey, just like with the rise of shopping centers, lock and camera technologies and other safety and security requirements that were built around, the risks and parameters of those working environments. This is the way that all business operates now. We all use technology to varying degrees, but it's always a critical part of how we receive and transact business, send, receive funds, and transact business. And so, as an extension of that, we naturally have to just think about how we do that responsibly, securely, and scale that effort consistently to scale with our business and what we're trying to achieve outside of, securing what we're doing.
Absolutely. And when we talk about confidentiality and availability and all the components of sort of our daily diet, the most important thing, I think, for us immediately is always the availability conversation. And so when organizations are thinking about that, and then what you have to build around those things to be able to continue to function and be up, because it's true. I mean, even our little Chinese food place across the street, they accept orders via the web, right? And so
Mhm.
really everyone is now in a place where there's some component of their life, and if they can't get orders, that impacts their business tremendously. And
Mhm.
so these are the things that I think we really need to focus on. And really try to move away from, we have to add yet another question to the application because we want to try and thread the needle of that particular piece of information. And so it's trying to get alignment to the difference between claims activity and incident activity, which we talk about a lot, which is, yes, we understand how all these people were penetrated, but at the same time, what we don't know is, was that 10%, 5%, 1%, 100%? And what happened to the other people who didn't have a claim? Did they not say they had a claim? Did they just not have an intrusion? And so these are the combinations of factors that we're trying to collect to understand more broadly how to change the racetrack of where we can identify and remediate incidents before they turn into financial impacts.
Well, that's I think a really interesting point, and one of the reasons actually that or initial topics that got us talking and so excited about our organizations working together was that you really, in that way, Cysurance has really kind of peeled back the surface of that conversation and gotten connected into some of the lifeblood of what makes or would enable or make a carrier able to be aware of that activity. And I think I'm really excited about the research that we're going to be putting out through the rest of this year and into next year in this area, because it's frankly like this Marsh McLennan paper, while incredible and very timely, is really just the tip of the iceberg, right? Like this is the start of the conversation, certainly not the end of the journey at all by any means. So, well, Kirsten, thank you so much again for joining me. Did you want to leave the audience with any thoughts as we wrap up?
I think just the ones that we were talking about, it's not particularly exciting, but certainly the fundamentals are key. And I think the most important factor is that no matter the size of an organization, there is the capability to be safe, and it doesn't have to be overly complex, and it doesn't have to be this long, infinite chasm that is required to be filled. And so that, I think, for me, is the biggest takeaway and validation, that every organization can put those controls in place and know that they're meaningful and helpful.
Yeah, 100%. Completely agree with you. Thank you so much, Kirsten, for joining me. And thank you to everybody for joining us today. Keep an eye out for our next session, which will be coming up here later in the month.
Thank you.
Take care.